There is a moment somewhere between the drawing of a weapon and the settling of what that weapon was drawn to settle, where history is made, without anyone present having the leisure to recognize it as such. The men who made it were not thinking about legacy. They were thinking about the ground in front of them, the animal beneath them, and whether the iron in their hand was equal to what the next 30 seconds required. The Texas Rangers lived inside that moment for 200 years, and the weapons they carried through those years were not relics, not symbols, not the decorative artifacts that museum glass would eventually make of them. They were the difference between the living and the dead, chosen by men who could not afford to choose wrongly, and refined by a frontier that punished every error without appeal. What follows is the story of those weapons, not as inventory, as history. In 1836, the Republic of Texas was a declaration of intent pressed against a landscape that had not yet agreed to honor it. The Comanche ruled the southern plains with a military sophistication that had defeated every conventional response sent against them, and the core of that sophistication was speed. A Comanche warrior at full gallop could loose arrow after arrow with a fluency of motion. That made the single-shot muzzleloader, reload, tamp, prime, fire, look like a man trying to answer lightning with a candle. The Rangers needed something that could speak the same language. What they found was a slender, 5-chambered revolver produced by a young Connecticut gunmaker who had never seen the Texas frontier and could not have imagined the use to which his creation was about to be put. The Colt Paterson did not look like a weapon that would rewrite the history of a continent. It was fine-boned, mechanically intricate, and unforgiving of rough handling. But Captain John Coffee Hayes understood what 5 shots delivered without reloading could mean, against an enemy whose entire tactical system was built around the assumption that 1 shot was all he would ever face. At Bandera Pass in 1841, Hayes led a company of Rangers into a Comanche engagement that the Comanche expected to end the same way every previous engagement had ended, with Rangers frantically reloading while warriors closed the distance at full speed. The second shot from Hayes's line stopped them. The third shot began the retreat. The Comanche rode away from a force a fraction of their size, and nothing on the southern plains was ever quite the same again. A revolver had not merely won a fight, it had broken an assumption that an entire warrior culture had built its dominance upon. The man who came next to the story had ridden with Hayes and bled for Texas, and understood with the authority of personal experience exactly where the Paterson had fallen short. Captain Samuel Walker wrote to Samuel Colt with the directness of a man who did not have time for correspondence that failed to arrive at its point. Heavier, more powerful, built to survive the kind of use that the Texas frontier considered ordinary. What emerged from that exchange was a revolver so large, so heavy, and so absolute in its intentions that it has never been surpassed in raw power among black powder revolvers produced anywhere on this continent before or since. The Colt Walker of 1847 weighed 4.5 pounds loaded. Its 9-inch barrel drove a heavy ball with a force that men who received it did not subsequently discuss. It was not a weapon that invited misunderstanding about what it was for. Walker carried it into the Mexican-American War and did not come home from Huamantla in October of that year. The gun outlasted the man. It always does. But the Walker revolver carried something of the Ranger captain's character forward through the decades that followed. The absolute refusal to be insufficient, the insistence on being equal to whatever the moment demanded, regardless of what the moment demanded. No frontier weapon before or since was built with quite that same declaration of intent written into its dimensions. The Dragoon of 1848 took what the Walker had established and made it survivable for the man required to carry it. Slightly reduced in its most extreme dimensions, refined in its mechanical execution, it became the sidearm that Rangers carried through the expansion of Texas authority across the hill country and into the vast territories beyond. It was a working gun. The frontier was working country. They understood each other. By 1860, the percussion revolver had been refined across 2.5 decades of Colt's ongoing conversation with what fighting men actually required. And the Army model that emerged from that refinement was the most balanced, most graceful, and most mechanically accomplished percussion revolver the American continent produced, where the Walker had been a declaration and the Dragoon a workhorse. The 1860 Army was something closer to a finished argument: 6 shots, elegant in the hand, reliable in the field, and present in such numbers across the Civil War years that it became the defining handgun of its generation. Then came 1873, and with it the weapon that the frontier would ultimately choose as its own signature, the Colt single-action army, chambered in .45 Colt, built to a standard of consistency that made every previous revolver look like a prototype. The Peacemaker. The name carried the particular frontier irony of a word applied to a thing that accomplished its purpose by making peace a less attractive option than compliance. Captain Lander McNelly carried the weight of that irony on the Nueces Strip in the mid-1870s. McNelly was a man whom physical appearance consistently deceived, slight, pale, already carrying the tuberculosis that would kill him before he reached 40, and whose personal authority over violent men in violent country remains one of the most remarkable phenomena the Ranger record produced. He led his special force through the Brasada country of South Texas against border raiders and cattle thieves with a directness that the legal architecture of territorial jurisdiction could not always contain, and that McNelly did not always wait for it to authorize. His Rangers carried the 1873 Colt into engagements that the newspapers of the day reported with the careful vagueness of editors who understood that some details served no one's interest in the telling. What those Rangers accomplished in that strip of South Texas brush country with that single-action revolver in their hands belongs to the most consequential and least comfortable chapter in 2 centuries of Ranger history. The Remington 1875 arrived not as a challenger seeking to displace what Colt had established, but as an alternative that certain Rangers chose on the most practical grounds available. It worked. It held together under conditions designed to destroy less honestly constructed weapons, and its solid frame architecture gave the mechanically inclined fighting man a confidence in the weapon's structural integrity that the open-top Colt design did not always provide. On the frontier, confidence in your weapon was not a luxury. It was a component of every decision you made in the field. The Smith and Wesson Schofield of 1875 addressed a different problem with a different solution. The top brake design that simultaneously ejected all 6 spent cases and presented the cylinder for reloading was not a refinement of the Colt's gate loading system. It was a rejection of it, in favor of something faster, more instinctive, better suited to the mounted man whose reloading time was measured not in comfort but in consequence. No handgun, however accomplished, reaches across the distances that the Texas frontier placed between a Ranger and the man he was pursuing. The long guns completed what the revolvers began, and the 2 that completed it most decisively were the Sharps 1874 and the Winchester 1886. The Sharps was a single-shot rifle built around the proposition that one shot placed with absolute precision at distances other weapons could not reach was worth more than any number of shots that fell short of their purpose. In the open country of West Texas, where a man on the run understood that distance was his primary protection, the Sharps removed that protection with a calm efficiency that the rifle's reputation preceded by enough distance to influence the decisions of men who had never personally tested it. The Winchester 1886 was John Moses Browning's answer to the question that every previous lever-action rifle had declined to fully address: a repeating long gun strong enough in its internal architecture to handle the heavy cartridges that serious work in serious country required. Rangers carrying the Winchester 1886 into the closing campaigns of the frontier era carried both reach and volume, the two qualities that the Texas frontier had been demanding of its defenders since John Coffee Hayes first raised a Paterson against a Comanche charge on a hill country pass in 1841. The weapons have changed beyond any recognition those men could manage. The world those weapons are carried into has changed with equal thoroughness. But the line connecting the Ranger at Bandera Pass to the Ranger in the Brasada to the Ranger in the last campaigns of the open frontier is a line that 2 centuries have not broken. A continuous thread of institutional character expressed in every era through the weapons the work required and the men who understood, without being told, what those weapons were for. The frontier shaped the Ranger shaped the weapons, and the weapons in the hands of men the country had made equal to carrying them shaped the history of a state and a nation that still bears the mark of what was decided. In fire and dust and the sharp arithmetic of close-range resolution across 200 years of Texas ground.